Okay with everyone. So Tansei Nwagamaгаnak, Miogisigansek, Drita Grays and Sigason, Nia Nehiao Esquel, Maskeo Sigahigana Cotinia. My name is Drita Grays and I'm Nehiao from Treaty 6 Territory and a current student in Race and Equality, Language and Education doctoral program here at the Graduate School of Education at Stanford University. I want to say Tansei, Tawau, and welcome to the March installment of the Haas Center for Public Services Research as Praxis Towards More Equitable Research Partnerships workshop series. This workshop series is designed for Stanford graduate students interested in learning more about and developing skills in community-engaged research, scholarship, and community-based research. Please note that this lecture is being recorded, and if you have any questions, please use the raise hand function. While the panelists are joining from across the world, I'm currently located on the homelands of the Ohlone Nation. As an uninvited guest to these lands, it's my hope that the work I contribute to while here supports the resurgence of all Indigenous peoples, and particularly the Ohlone. The dispossession of Indigenous peoples from their lands has had disastrous repercussions. As we reckon with the impacts of climate change, we recognize that we all suffer when Indigenous ways of knowing and being are suppressed. Each of the panelists today have made vast contributions to the intellectual landscape and are what we would refer to in my language as Ogimau Esquewak or leader women. It's my privilege to introduce today's panelists. Dr. Melissa Arcand is from the Muskeg Lake Cree Nation and is an assistant professor in the Department of Soil Science at the University of Saskatchewan. As a soil biogeochemist, Dr. Arcand has developed a new area of applied and interdisciplinary research in Indigenous agricultural land management. Working closely with First Nations land managers, they are assessing the effects of long-term agricultural leasing on soil health and reconsidering notions of agricultural land capability on First Nations land. Dr. Carletta Chief is an associate professor and extension specialist in the Department of Environmental Science at the University of Arizona. Dr. Chief is Dene, originally from Black Mesa, Arizona. Her research focuses on how Indigenous communities will be affected by climate change. She has collaborated with an interdisciplinary group of scientists to determine how hydrological models can be improved to identify and mitigate risks to vulnerable populations. She brings relevant science to Native American communities in a culturally sensitive manner by providing hydrology expertise, transferring knowledge, assessing information needs, and developing applied science projects. Dr. Nidia Rudas Gracia is an assistant professor of educational psychology at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Her research seeks to develop a nuanced understanding of what it means to belong and how this sense of belonging impacts life outcomes, such as academic performance and mental health. Her work focuses on exploring these concepts among culturally diverse populations and examining how sense of belonging is associated with various social identities, such as gender, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, etc. Each of the panelists will now begin with a short overview of their work and will begin to answer the question, how do you continue to collaborate on community engaged research projects after the data has been collected? Please join me in welcoming Drs. Melissa Arcand, Carletta Chief, and Ruedes Gracia. E-snaps, and we'll begin with Dr. Melissa Arcand.
Great, thanks, Dorita. So I guess I will share some slides, mostly because I want to show photos of the landscapes that I work in, and I think it's given the fact that we are, remote, we have the opportunity to maybe bring you into my area here. Oh, it says I cannot start screen share while your screen or somebody else is screen sharing. Okay, let's see if this works. All right, just a second. Okay, well, thanks, Dorita. I'm really looking forward to being on this panel with these other two, it's very good academics, so it's exciting for me to be here. As Dorita mentioned, I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Soil Science, and I'm also from the Muskeg Lake Cree Nation, which is located in Treaty 6 territory. So I'm in Canada. in the province of Saskatchewan, actually, and I'm presenting from my home here in the city of Saskatoon. I'm a soil scientist, and my training has been in the study of soils. So very much the type of data that I have been trained to collect and that I predominantly do collect as part of my current research program is biophysical data. Hard numbers about soils and about land. But in my more recent development of my research program, which has really taken an applied component working with First Nations communities, I have come to be more of a community-based researcher, but not through maybe quote unquote traditional means. So I've come to it through almost my position of privilege as being a professor and with the access to First Nations communities as being a member of these communities. So my background might be similar, but also different to some of the other panelists. And certainly I would say I'm still very much a learner in community-based research. I in no way would consider myself an expert in this area, but I'm looking forward to hearing from the other panelists and how they do their research, because I think I have a lot to learn from them. So what I'm going to do is just kind of provide a bit of a background as to how does a soil scientist get into this type of community-based research, and that is focused on working with Indigenous communities and in the territory that I'm currently residing in. So it's a background because I think for a lot of people potentially on this call, you might not appreciate the importance that soils play in society. And for me, my research really focuses in on agricultural systems. And that's because that's the predominant land use in the area that I'm from. You look anywhere around outside of our very small cities and we are agricultural lands, fields after fields after fields. And so soils are really fundamental to agricultural systems. That's how food grows out of soil. But we also know that mismanagement of soil can lead to soil degradation that can impact food security, and as well impact the other components of the ecosystem. So pollution of water, pollution of air can occur when we mismanage soils within an agricultural context. Soils are sinks and sources for greenhouse gases. And so a lot of us in the soil science discipline are really concerned with climate change research. We're looking at ways that soils can be managed to mitigate against climate change and other aspects related to climate change. But my research has led into more of looking at the intersection between soils and Indigenous land management, and really that the history of colonization of the plains has really relied on exploiting our soil resource for agricultural production. And so there's a whole history that I could go into how this happened, but what I'm going to talk more about is how that history of marginalization really affects the present day landscape and the decisions that are being made by First Nations communities on the ground today. So this is a Google Earth image of sort of the northern Great Plains that extend up into Canada. And so I'm situated in Saskatchewan, which is to the right of the screen. And then we've got Alberta to the west and then the Rocky Mountains. And so we're just sitting on top of Montana, basically. And all of these small postage stamp sized areas of land are First Nations reserves. So in the United States, you would refer to them as reservations. In Canada, we call them reserves. And these are legal boundaries. Within the boundaries of this land is actually held in legal title by the Crown. So First Nations communities don't actually own the land. It's held in legal title by the Crown. And so a lot of decisions that are made about these lands are often facilitated through what would have been Indian Affairs, what is now Indigenous Services Canada. But my point here that I want to make, and by showing this image, is that where First Nations lands are located currently are often in places where the soils are very marginal. And this was very intentional as the prairies were settled to make way for European farming. and that these lands, because of their marginal characteristics, weren't developed to the same extent for agriculture. And there's a number of barriers in addition to in addition to biophysical barriers why this occurred. That can be, we can go into that in a lot more detail later. But the point being is that our lands tend to be located on more marginal soils, which means if there's mismanagement of those lands, they're more susceptible to degradation. They're less resilient in the face of changes. Now, in Saskatchewan, there are probably about 54 First Nations communities that are located within the agricultural region. And these communities often actually lease their land to non-Indigenous farmers. Even though the land might be marginal, there is still some agricultural land and quite a bit of agricultural land located within First Nations communities, but most of it, the vast majority, is leased. And a lot of the communities are concerned about this lease arrangement. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, but first I just want to mention that although many of our communities are located on marginal lands, we've been able to increase the size of our land bases in the last 20 years or so through what's called treaty land entitlement, as well as through specific claims that have enabled us to, through the court system, basically win money for what we had, been able to demonstrate legally had been mismanagement of resources by the government. And so many communities are now purchasing land outside of their original reserve boundaries. And a lot of this land is agricultural land. So this map that I'm showing here, we've got this main parcel of land, this big sort of body of land that would have been the home reserve. And then all of these smaller pieces of land are newly acquired land that this First Nation recently bought in the last 20 years or so. And most of this land is agricultural. And we're talking in the plains, when we talk about agricultural land, it's not like agricultural land in California. The scale of the land base is massive. So we're talking in the hundreds, tens to hundreds of thousands of acres. And First Nations communities are concerned with the historical management of these lands because they're concerned about whether or not they are potentially getting fair market value for the land that they're renting out to non-Indigenous farmers. So there's lots of concerns over this leased land. So fair market rates is a big concern. And another concern is whether sustainable agricultural practices are actually being implemented on their lands. And this leads to questions about effects of soil and water quality, as well as destruction of habitat and declines of biodiversity. And so a lot of the work that I've initiated sprung out of this question of what is this sort of long-term effect of non-Indigenous farmers farming Indigenous land. And so this ultimately arose in the establishment of a new research project that I have ongoing. It's entitled Mio Mamawi Atoskoin, which means working together in a good way. And it's an interdisciplinary project with myself, other soil scientists, Indigenous scholars who are historians or geographers, as well as 2 First Nations communities, and working very closely with their working closely with their lands departments to assess agricultural land. So although what we are primarily, at least my lab, what we're primarily concerned with is collecting biophysical data. We want to know how have the soils been affected by land tenure, by agricultural management practices. But this data is ultimately going to be used by the community for land use planning and for establishing agricultural land management practices that they can then say to the farmers that lease their land, these are the things that we require you to do to ensure that our land is being managed appropriately. And then also the collection of this biophysical data is informed by community knowledge. So we are really where we're sampling, where we're identifying lands of interest is really being informed through the community members themselves. And so through interviews, meetings, we are identifying the research priorities within each First Nation, and those priorities might be quite different, though there's a lot of overlap. So the other thing that's really come about of this research, which is honestly not surprising at all, is that their concerns extend beyond my own area of expertise. And so what this has meant is that in terms of ongoing collaboration and work within the small amount of years that you can do within a singular research grant, it leads to more questions, which leads to the further strengthening of that relationship. At least that's what's happened so far, but I can see, and maybe we'll get into this later, of how that can not always be the case. But this collaboration so far has been very iterative and ongoing, and certainly extends beyond the life of a research grant. And in this case, was initiated prior to there being any access to funds to be able to actually have the resources to do any kind of data collection itself. It started off with the relationship building. So maybe I'll stop there, and I think I've taken up my 10 minutes, and just, I look forward to the questions that are to come. Thanks, Trita.
Thank you so much, Dr. Arcand. So just some e-snaps. It's always so strange, normally we'd be clapping or doing something in real life, but we are affirming you. So now I'd like to welcome Dr. Carletta Chief.
Can you see my presentation?
We can, yep.
Okay, in the right mode, right?
Yep, I think so. Yep.
Okay, great. Ja, anal tá sé thoid éis lá tá hanna ba sin as a lena da sé dó na touching da sinile a chut é sanle. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to the Haas Center for inviting me here today. And I'm actually a Stanford alum, so I'm wearing my Stanford gear here. Got my bachelor's and master's in civil and environmental engineering. And I only went to the Haas Center to study fluid mechanics in a study group. So unfortunately, I never had the advantage of doing anything other than engineering while I was there. And as an engineering student, I didn't really have any connection with community, though the reasons why I went to get my degree was to give back to my own community. So I had to leave Stanford to do that. And hopefully the engineering department is better these days. Today, I wanted to share a project that I ended last year on the Gold King mine spill that happened on the Navajo Nation. And this was a community-driven project with the Navajo Nation. So prior to the Gold King mine spill that occurred in 2015, we were already out in the community doing outreach with tribal nations, specifically with the tribal colleges on the Navajo Nation and with the Tohono O'odham. So we were looking at mighty impacts to tribal waters and how we can work with tribal colleges and tribal college students to develop learning modules in mining. I also was invited to the Shiprock Agricultural Days during the springtime. And this was an event for Navajo farmers to learn about various agricultural trainings that could help them in their farming. And this is held by the extension agents located in and around the Navajo Nation. I received an invitation to present to the newly elected president of the Navajo Nation back in August. And shortly after that, I was asked while I was presenting about what I thought about the Gold Key mine spill and what were the impacts to the Navajo Nation. I was presenting on climate change and the outreach that we were doing, and I wasn't privy to know about what had just happened, as it was not public knowledge. So I had no idea what the Navajo Nation's EPA question was about, and I did poorly at answering. Shortly thereafter, I learned about the Gold Key mine spill and the 3 million gallons of acid mine drainage that went into the river. And so I reached out again to the extension agents that work on the tribal lands. So we have several extension agents on tribal lands and 3 on the Navajo Nation. So I specifically worked with Jeannie Benally, who was based in Shiprock, which is a community along the Sawa River. And through her interactions, we began to know about what the Navajo people's concerns were. They depended on the river for farming, but also was dependent on the river for other cultural and spiritual practices. In addition, many of the farmers use heirloom seeds to grow corn, and so they didn't want to lose the corn. And they were concerned about what were the generational impacts to their children. Jeannie Benally also said there wasn't a lot of information available to the farmers about the spill. So the first thing we did was we did an interview and talked about the Gold Key mine spill based on our own work with the Superfund research program. And then from there, we worked with Jeannie Benally to list what the most frequently asked questions were about the spill and develop this fact sheet 2 weeks after the spill occurred. And so Jeannie allowed this to, she passed these out at the farming meetings and the other community meetings about the spill. So the key thing I want to iterate in this project is that we had already been doing work in the communities. We were asked the question and we worked with the community members and the extension agent to identify questions. And then we, through those efforts and through the follow-up of the Navajo EPA asking the question, we had several conversations to follow up about their questions. And through that, they invited us to submit concept proposals. And we submitted 2 of them, one focusing on the environmental health, and the second one focusing on the hydrologic aspect of the spill. So the Navajo Nation decided that they were more interested in the environmental health. How would the spill impact the people? And so we quickly brought together partners that we had already been working with, including Diné College, which is the oldest tribal college in the United States, Tobenehidzi, which is Water Makes Us Strong, is a grassroots organization, the Navajo Nation community health representatives who work as first responders, NAU, Northern Arizona University, located near the Navajo Nation, and Fort Lewis College. So the community was the driver in developing the research questions that we presented. And we brought together a set of team that was very interdisciplinary, crossing the expertise of social, environmental, and health sciences with our university and community partners. And with all our partners, especially those that were not Indigenous, we ensured that they had training not only in the human subjects, but also the cultural aspects of what it means to work within these communities. The goals of our project were to understand how the spill impacted the people, specifically through human exposure, what was the short-term exposure to the spill. Secondly, to determine the levels of arsenic and lead in the environment within these 3 communities. And then also to survey what the people thought about their risks and report back measured risks. So we went into the communities and had presentations and asked the people about their concerns, what were the water sources that were important to them, what do they think were impacts to their land, crops, home health, livestock, and then how would they like the information reported back to them. So in the listening sessions that we held in the spring of 2016, the people said they don't trust research, especially since their livelihoods are not considered. They fear that the water isn't safe and they're concerned about future impacts to the river. They also were frustrated there were no data decision-making protocols and that they were concerned that the data wouldn't come back to them. We also use the decolonized approach, which is centered within the Diné fundamental philosophy of Hojo, and that is their own problem-solving approach, which involves sahakes, critical thinking, nahata, planning, ina, and sithasin. And then in terms of the reporting back, we also centered the results within the Diné worldview, which is focused on spiritual wellness, economy, livelihood, family and community, and the environment. So we centered all the results based on that. For example, within spiritual wellness, there were negative impacts to ceremony. Within economy and livelihood, there was impacts to the finances with the revenue they get from farming. Within family and community, they felt like there were impacts to their mental health, including having worry, fear, depression, and so forth. Within the environment, they felt negative feelings towards the river, had less access to the traditional plants and herbs they use, and felt a damaged relationship with the river and the land. Communication with the community is so critical in every single aspect, from before the research proposal to developing the questions, the proposals, collecting data, analyzing and synthesizing the data. So we really involved the community in every aspect. We had 24 teach-ins, 3 listening sessions, 3 radio forums. We developed a citizen science project with the farmers where the farmers collected their agricultural soil, agricultural water, the seeds that they planted, the corn, before, during, and after the harvest. This was all led by tribal college students. So the tribal college students were all involved, as well as the CHRs in terms of training them, analyzing the data. We had tribal college students come to the university for many years each year to do their research on this project. So the Navajo communities believe that it was time to work together and to restore the community from the spill and to become more resilient into the future. This was an extensive project, many details I left out within this 10 minutes, but we were able to get some funding both on and off campus. And it was great to really work with the community in this way. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chief. Wonderful to hear a little bit of the work there in Arizona. Now I'd like to welcome Dr. Nidia Ruedas Gracia, who is also a Stanford alum. So thank you, Dr. Chief, and welcome to Nidia.
Yes, also was at Stanford in the, we call it College of Education here. Stanford is Graduate School of Education. Let me see, let me share my screen. And this one is the one I want to share. Yes. Okay. Bring your faces over to my screen. Okay, cool. All right, so yes, Nieves Gracia. I'm at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, was at Stanford before this, doing amazing work with my advisor, Dr. Teresa LaFramboise, which I'll talk a little bit about projects we've done. Want to leave as much time as possible for the awesome questions. So I'm just going to get moving. I'm going to talk less about the details of my work and more of the collaborative projects that I've been doing in the kind of community-based projects, to then stem maybe some more research, some more questions from the crew. All right, so about me, assistant professor in educational psychology. So doing a cognitive switch a little bit over to psychology. It was amazing watching these presentations. So thank you, Melissa and Carletta, because it is not what I get to see a lot of times in my lab. So this was amazing to have that perspective. I don't identify as Native. My family doesn't know too much about our family history, but you know, we think there's a little bit of that in us, and we just don't know. I identify mostly as Latina, Mexican American from Los Angeles, California, woman of color, from a low income background, first gen low income background as well. Somebody in the room already caught my shirt. So this is an LSP shirt from Stanford. The Leland Scholars Program is kind of a kind of summer transition program, but really a for life program for first gen low income undergrads at Stanford. And I was blessed to be able to mentor and be a kind of co-instructor for some classes for them. And so I have that background as well as first gen low income coming into academia. My name is long because it's my dad's and my mom's. So it's Ruedas for my dad and Gracia for my mom. I have lots of hobbies like singing and dancing and being very extroverted. And then I have a lot of research interests, which I'll go off into in a bit. I'm going to go like very superficially over the research interests. But if you want to know more details, I do have that website there. And then you can follow me on Instagrams and Twitters. Okay. So I kind of have two prongs to my research, or two arms to it. The first one is that I like to explore sociocultural factors that impact academic performance and well-being among culturally diverse students. And then the second arm, so the first one is like, you know, exploring that, really getting into the details of how sociocultural factors can affect performance. And the second arm is using that work to inform and develop culturally sustaining interventions for minoritized students. And so when I say sociocultural factors, it's italicized because that's pretty broad. Specifically for the past half a decade now or more, I've been focusing on sense of belonging. So what does sense of belonging mean to different communities? How does it affect them? And how does society kind of influence a student's sense of belonging? I'll quickly go into some details into some collaborative work that I've been looking at. And for each one, I tried to give some tips or kind of insight into what made it culturally relevant, sustaining, or revitalizing. So a lot of my work, as soon as I go into a community, I have all of those syllables in my mind, and I remind everybody on my team of all those words. We want this to be culturally relevant, we want it to be culturally sustaining, and we want it to be culturally revitalizing as much as possible. And so from the get-go, all of my lab students and myself and my collaborators, I tell them, you'll get annoyed by how much I'm going to say these words, but it's very important and critical to a lot of my work, of community-based work. And those three words are different. So there's different scholars that talk about each of those aspects. And so I'm happy to talk about it offline. But those three words mean very different things. And they're very important for, I think, conducting great work in the community. So Some of my experience has been collaborative work with Native reservation communities. And this I learned a lot from my advisor, Teresa Laframboise at Stanford. So we did a lot of this work together. She drove it and had all the capital and connections and knowledge and wisdom. I was just the grad student tagging along and wanting to learn. So I learned a lot from this type of work where we would work directly with reservation communities. And yes, get some publications out of it, but I learned way more than just going in there and getting data. One of the key things that I learned was the concept of tribal IRB. So, and this is not specific just to Native communities. So sometimes districts, like school districts, will have their own IRB. And so that's something I learned as a grad student, that oftentimes, well, sometimes when you go out into communities, they might have their own IRB. And I learned that in academic spaces, sometimes those can be seen as like bothers or extra work, or we just don't want to deal with that. But to me, I really appreciated that. And I actually kind of, when I work now with communities, I ask them, like, do you have a IRB? Because I love the idea of it being a check on academia and on our system. So tribal IRBs, for those of you who don't know, are so at the academic, on the academic side, whenever you're working with human people, with humans, you have to get that approved by the university's institutional review board. They have to kind of make sure that you're being ethical and that you're not doing anything shady. And so the tribal community will have their own IRB. So Dr. Laframboise and I not only had to get our study approved by Stanford University's IRB, but we also had to get it approved by the tribal community's IRB. And we made an agreement with them that anything, as soon as we started writing something up for either a conference presentation or a publication for a journal, they had to approve that first. So anything that you see that gets published from her or I, that's looking at that as a site, know that exact manuscript got approved by the tribal IRB. So that's something I learned from that one. Another one that I'm currently working on is, so I'm currently in Champaign-Urbana, CU, in Illinois, and me and my colleagues are looking at the COVID disparities that are obviously happening all over the world in the US, but it's happening to us too here. And we've gotten some funds to figure out how we can mitigate these disparities, or how can we decrease these disparities in our town. So here I'm drawing a lot from the work that Dr. Loma Waima has put out on historical trauma and how systems have influenced individuals' behavior and decision-making processes due to mistrust in the healthcare system and that kind of thing. Very adequately put, mistrust. It's for good reason. And so something that I'm incorporating from that work, is something that I'm doing in that project, is iterative check-ins. So before we went out into the community and said, here's some money, this is how we're going to fix this, we have started off with interviews. So we're interviewing community members all over our town and asking them what they need, what they want. And during that interview, we say, like, what if we did this thing? How would that go? What if we did this? And trying to get a notion of, like, how are they going to feel about these researchers coming in, and it could be seen as seizing on this opportunity of a pandemic to get some really cool publications out. And so we don't want to do that. So we've started with these interviews that serve as check-ins, and then we have them in place throughout our project, so that at any time and point, all of my colleagues and I have agreed that if at any time and point when we do these check-ins, the community says, like, no, I think you're overstepping, or like, no, I think this is actually going to hurt more, that's going to help, we immediately come together and have a plan in place to figure out what we're going to do, and we're comfortable with changing route if we need to. And then the third project that I'm doing is a middle school student engagement project. So a middle school counselor reached out to me and really just wanted to see how to increase student engagement among their middle school students. They're all online, they're all virtual. It's just, a hot mess all over. And so I said, yeah, let's do this. And what I did was I drew from the work by Dr. Stephanie Freiberg, who's also a psychologist, and I think she also went to Stanford, I think. But she does a lot of really cool, she has like a couple papers of like interventions at the middle school level and high school level and college level. And I think that those are culturally relevant and sustaining interventions. So check out her work for that. But I'm drawing from her work in possibly implementing intervention at this middle school. But the fun fact about this is I put in there step 1, no research output, because the district was not comfortable yet with researchers coming in and collecting data while they were also trying to deal with this pandemic and having students, disengaged. And so they, basically they're saying we got other stuff to worry about. And so the counselor was kind of sad, and he was like, well, I get it. If you can't collect data, then you can't come help us. And I said, no. What we're going to do is we're going to run the survey that you need for your students, and we're going to do the data analysis, and we're going to provide you that report. And once people are ready for us to come back into the schools, then we'll work it out with IRB. We'll ask them if we can use that data. If we can't use that data, it's fine. There's no strings attached to this. This is something that you need first. And he was very surprised that we were going to do that. But it's just, something I learned also from my advisor, Dr. LaFon Boyce. It doesn't always have to be tied to a research output. So those are some projects I'm working on. I'm happy to answer more details on them, but I thought it might be more important to talk about some things I've learned from each of them and who I learned them from. So I think I'm done. I think that was my last slide. Yeah. Okay, I'm done.
Great, wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Juarez Gracia. And so now we're going to use some questions from the RSVP form, which you provided when you signed up to attend the talk. So I'm just going to cycle through the questions, and then if anyone wants to jump in, Melissa, Carletta, or Nydia when we begin, or we can just cycle through. So the first question was, if you're not the primary person in charge of the study, for example, if you're just a research assistant or research staff level, what are things you can do to continue community building relationships, especially when you're limited in your role and on what you're able to promise to study partners?
I guess I'll take a stab at this one. I actually found this one the hardest for me because my grad training, like as somebody, I wasn't engaged in that kind of community-based research. So my perspective is more from the PI. But I guess as a PI though, I think it's my role to ensure that the community, that relationship is one that extends beyond any other person who might be on the project who works under me, whose role is limited, to ensure that that the community understands that the relationship building is ongoing. But I think probably being really clear about who like with each person who's on the project, whether it's a summer student who's only going to work for 3 months, or a research technician who maybe all they do is collect soil samples, is just to be really clear about each person's role. So, I mean, that was kind of my initial thoughts. Like I said, I think this was actually the hardest question because I don't have the experience myself, but maybe Nydia or Carletta probably have some really good points to share with respect to that.
Yes, thank you for that question. And Dr. Arcand answered it very similarly to how I would have answered it, in that I have, she talked about privilege of doing this type of work as a professor, and it is a privilege. And that's one of the reasons that motivated me to do my PhD, because I could have the flexibility to do this type of work. And especially being an extension specialist, that work is valued through my tenure and promotion as a professor. But I do have a training program that's funded by the National Science Foundation called Indigenous Food, Energy, Water Security, and Sovereignty, where I'm training graduate students to work with Indigenous communities to address the food, energy, water challenges that they face. In this training, a third of the students are Indigenous, but the rest are not. And so I tell my students that, about the community partnership building, the tribal IRB process, and that if a student wants to do research with a tribe, that they should know that it's going to take a long time. It's not something you can do within 3 months and even a year, mainly because you have to build a partnership, the trust, and be invited and be trusted by the community. And so that takes a long time. And so it's not always something that a student can do. And it's really, the faculty or the lead PI who is going to forge ahead in that way, and have already done that type of work to mentor the students to be able to do that. So, the best way is that a student has a good mentor, like with Dr. Rudia Gracia. She was mentored by Dr. Teresa LaFramboise, who has a history of that type of collaboration and trust. So if you can find faculty or a mentor that has already built that, and can mentor you through that process, I think that's the best way. There are some students in my program that have been able to do it on their own, mainly because they're doing it with their tribe, and they've already done previous research with their tribe, and they've already had some approvals and trust building prior to entering their graduate program. But I think that's unusual. I think the best way to start that process is to, first of all, be invited. And that might mean finding a mentor, a community mentor who can show you and guide you about the cultural protocols. Because I really like what Dr. Rudia Garcia said about cultural sensitivity, the cultural protocols that are critical that a student or researcher has to abide by when they're going into the communities. With my work, the Navajo IRB was the one that was the oversight, and that was their main question. How is your research culturally relevant? How is it culturally sensitive? How are you benefiting the Diné people? That was the primary question. It wasn't about when are you going to get your publications out? When are you going to get that manuscript to us? It was really community and culturally centered. So I think the best way is to be invited, to have a cultural mentor, a cultural expert to train you, to know what those cultural protocols are, and to take it slow and not expect it to happen quickly. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. So our next question is about challenges. So what is one challenge that you faced while conducting community engaged research, and how did you overcome it?
Nadia, do you want to tackle that last question?
Sure. The challenge question. Many challenges. I'm trying to pick one. I think one, kind of going off of Dr. Chief's idea of like it takes time. In academia and especially in psychology, like they don't like that it takes a lot of time. And so you're gonna have to, well, I kind of went up against that because there was that point of like academia wants me to complete my dissertation by a certain time, right? And or I'm on the tenure track right now, so the quick easy project I can push really quickly, those are the ones that are valued, those are the ones that are getting the money to run. And so that's been one challenge, because it's a tension, because I understand the need to build community relationships, and I understand that they take time and they take funding and they take energy. But then the people over here giving my money are the ones funding me and giving me my money are the ones saying like, no, do the fast ones. And so how are we going to do these really quality projects if there's that tension? So that's one challenge that I've faced. And how I overcame it, it's a constant thing. I think I kind of had to take it by project and by time. One thing that I've done is sometimes what I do is if I've gotten enough buy-in from the community, I could say like, hey, this is the deal here. Unfortunately, this grant fund that's going to fund our larger project, they kind of want a deliverable that's soon. And so how can we come up with something together that we can come up with some deliverable? And it's okay if it's not my best work, or if it's not what's going to get me that tenure, I'm fine with that. But it's going to open that door for the continued project in the future waves. So if they're okay with that, then we do that. But if the community is not okay with that, I was like, fine, we don't need that. We don't need that grant funder. We can move it on to something else. So that would be one thing where I kind of decided to be flexible and work with the community, let them know what my challenges were and what my struggles were, and then see if they could help me figure that out. And oftentimes they do help me figure it out. They have amazing solutions. But when that's not the case, when there's nothing to be done and we can't seem to figure it out, I think it's just being very, very strategic. So I put on my finesser hat and I'm like, all right, how are we gonna make this happen? So it is a challenge, and I take it kind of project by project. Sometimes I find like an ally on the committee that's providing the grant, and I kind of talk to them and say, hey, this is community-based research. This is how it's different from what you're used to funding. Can we talk about this and see how we can open up the door for more community-based research to be able to apply for your grant? So kind of being very, I sit at my reflection table and like write things out, but you kind of have to be strategic because it's not something that the system is kind of built for, and so you kind of have to work with them and then try to show them that there are other ways. So it's not perfect, but that's kind of how I've been doing it lately.
Yeah, I guess I'll chime in next. I totally, something that you had said, I totally resonated with me too, in terms of the challenge of doing community-based research when the research output isn't like, there's my immediate publications. And for the work that I'm doing now, it actually took quite a number of years to even find a place where where I could find a funder. And that's just part of the structure of the way the Canadian academic granting agencies work, as well as, and a lot of, historically, actually only until like maybe 2 or 3 years ago, our national funding agencies in the natural sciences, for there to be any sort of community-based work, it was really not community-based. It was, are you working with an industry? It was very industry driven. If you're working in the natural sciences, if you're a social scientist, that was different. But if you were a natural scientist and you're a research partner was going to be a community, that community would have to be able to front X number of dollars as matching funds. And usually eligible organizations were associated with industry in some way or another. And that's since changed, but only in the last like 3 years or so. And so a lot of the relationship building that had happened that preceded me being able to get the funding that I have now, there was no immediate understanding of there being a research output. It was actually really associated with a lot of the teaching that I do. So one of the communities with whom I'm now collaborating with, that initial sort of point of contact was through some teaching that I was doing on their land base that was both associated with their elementary school, as well as a certificate program that I'm currently teaching in Indigenous land management. So it's actually stemmed from a point of education that then through understanding of the kind of work I do, they then sort of saw the benefit that me being involved with some of their questions that they had could spin towards research. But it took some time to actually be able to get those research dollars in place. So that was a huge barrier. Just and with along the tenure and promotion process. At that time, I was not tenured yet. And so I even had other, mentors basically discourage me from engaging in that work until I had, the box checked for tenure and promotion processes. So that was a really big challenge. So just to, sort of support the challenge you are facing, Nydia, and similar to me as well, I can relate to that. The other quick thing that I just want to mention too, as someone trained in the natural sciences, a big challenge has been just understanding how to do community engaged research. And the way that I've been trying to address that is just by collaborating with social scientists and other Indigenous scholars. That's been absolutely critical. And so in terms of mentorship, like they're my mentors, even as, even I feel pretty confident in my field, I don't feel confident in that aspect. So those are my mentors that I still rely on sort of on the daily. So, but I guess I'll stop there.
Okay, this is great conversation. For the challenges question, we call it a wild card. And, sometimes things come up where you're just not expecting it. And so we always called it a wild card. But I think the challenge I can say comes from the university aspect, like when it comes with related to data sovereignty, where data sovereignty and then the data oversight. So for me and my project, the Navajo IRB is the oversight. And they defined research broadly, including, like doing interviews and sometimes can involve environmental sampling, which a lot of research in the environment will say, oh, that's not human subject. But with the tribe, they see all natural things as living entities. So they have the authority to be overseeing that. And then also with the data, so the data collected belongs to the Navajo Nation. And it says in their research code that they have authority for that. But with the university, they often don't see it this way because the research was done by a professor employed by the university, using university institutions and resources. So they say, oh, the data belongs to the university, but really because the research is done with the Navajo Nation, the data belongs to the Navajo Nation. And then oftentimes the Navajo IRB will ask for things from us, like amendments or different things, with a stamp from the University IRB. But then the University IRB will come back and say, oh, we don't need to do that. It's, it's waived, or we don't do that step. But then the Navajo IRB will say, well, we need to have that. So there's this like going back and forth that I have to do, and having the university understand that the tribe has authority to ask for these things because the research is overseen by the Navajo IRB. So that would be one challenge related to university. And then with the community, it's more like understanding, I think, when I would say challenges, quote unquote, occur. For example, one concern that came up by the community was them not trusting how the soil and water samples were processed. We would take the samples, take it back to the lab, we come back with the data, and they would ask, well, how did you get to this number? Where are you getting this data? So we went through and we detailed the steps, the methodology to the community, and then we had community members come to our lab. And this is like a 6 to 8 hour either drive, or they could take a small plane down to Tucson and see the lab. And so that's all part of trust building too, and ensuring that, yes, we're willing to provide all our methods to show them the lab, to bring them down, to give them the data, for them to collect the samples themselves. And we even did some of the processing at the tribal college, like with the acidification of the water samples. So that part of it is trust building. And so we just work through that and basically try to be as transparent as we can. Thank you.
Thank you. We also have a question in the chat. Jorge, did you want to unmute to ask your question?
Sure, thank you. I was wondering, Dr. Nelia, in your research around belonging, if you had employed any of your learnings about belonging in your methods design or in your work in community around your research.
Yes. Where do I start again? Yes. So a lot of it, one is also kind of reconceptualizing sense of belonging. So the sense of belonging has kind of in the psychology field kind of been a Western. There's been like kind of Western perspectives to sense of belonging, but actually at its core, it's something that comes from Indigenous frameworks. And so part of my work has been to kind of recenter appropriately to Indigenous kind of perspectives around sense of belonging and what that means. So that's been kind of before methods, right? Getting to the theory and the kind of conceptualization of sense of belonging and what it actually means in the definition. But then in terms of methods, it definitely has helped in terms of community-based research to think about what scales I'm using, what methods I'm using to study belonging. So for example, through community-based research, we run interviews and focus groups, and oftentimes we ask about what is your sense of belonging to this community or sense of belonging to school. And during those focus groups, I realized that especially if a population is minoritized, a lot of these scales are not created with them in mind or with their definition of belonging means. And so you might just have a lot of error statistically because this latent variable of belonging is not being captured appropriately with that established measure. Also, something really cool that came up that I will always remember, it happened maybe like 5-ish years ago now, is that we were in an Indigenous community and they said, oh, what scale are you using for sense of belonging? And we showed them the scale, it's going to be on the survey, it's about to go out. And they're like, so how is that going to work? It's a white man's scale and you're using it in an Indigenous context. And so that has really stuck with me too, to think about how were these scales made, what populations were in the conversation, and then from there, that scale is made and validated and used everywhere. Is it really giving you the results that you think you're getting? So conversations with communities have really helped in terms of how I measure it, and then which design I use. So sometimes in some studies I've opted for qualitative measuring of belonging because I looked at all the scales and I was like, none of these are going to work with this population that I'm currently working with. And so it's definitely been really helpful. And I encourage to mold that. Don't keep those separate. I think they're very important. Community-based research and community-based kind of thinking and strategizing and theorizing can be very much implemented into the work that you do. Hopefully I answered your question.
Thank you.
Awesome. Here is a interesting question that came from the RSVP. What are some of the best practices for making sure the knowledge we produce materially serves the interests of our research participants? And I think that's sort of connected to another question that was talking about sort of the unequal power dynamics that may occur as people with institutional privilege working with community members.
I can see a couple. Oh, Melissa, did you want to go?
No, you go ahead. I'll follow up after you.
I'll give some like quick applied ones that you can do. One is give before you get. So that can be in the form of a report. So oftentimes we go and we conduct our survey and our focus groups and interviews, but before we even think about which publication we're going to write this manuscript as, we write, and Dr. LaFrance was the one that taught me this awesome thing, but we wrote a very full report of the research that the community was interested in and everything else that we did. And we put a lot of work to it, and the first product that came out of the study. So that would be one thing. It doesn't always have to be a brief report. It can also be like via funding. So with the project that we're doing here around COVID, we're interviewing and providing stipends and helping out with efforts. And so providing that funding first before we go in and conduct any research. So that's one thing I would say that is helpful in my mind, in my lab, is to give first, and then from there, then you talk and figure out what your deliverable will be for your research. And then what was the other part? I think yeah, like the fair trade, right? Is that the fair trade question? And I still don't think it's going to be fair. I think even if the researcher gives more than gets, I still don't think it's going to be fair. So I think remembering that, and I remind my like collaborators and undergrads and grads, like, you could still do more. And it's not just in terms of being there. The way you write up your paper, does it have a deficit model of like a deficit thinking in the way that you write up your manuscript? Did you write the manuscript and then go back to the community and say like, hey, does this look okay? Like, did I interpret that correctly? That's another way to have some check-ins for yourself. Yeah, I don't think it's a fair trade. Researchers, we have a lot of power and privilege, as mentioned before. So we're always gonna come out winning, I feel, in academia. And so you could just try. You should still do the most, but don't feel like after doing the most that you're like, okay, cool, I did my best. I think it's still going to be unfair, but we can work toward providing, being more culturally, sustaining in that sense. So that would be my like practical advice of like, give before you get. There's a lot of ways that you can do it, and use your mentors, use others who have published things, using community-based research, ask them what they did. That can be really helpful too.
I could chime in on that question. For the results in our project, we listen to the community and what they would like to see and provide support in instances where they need that data right away. So they're not necessarily, actually most of the time, they're not research publications. So for example, we do fact sheets, we do terminology translations with the help of a cultural Navajo Diné linguist, and we do videos in the Navajo language. Most of the citizens that we work with, that are decision makers, speak Navajo primarily, and the Diné language is not written. I mean, it's written, but it's not, often used in written form. So most of the information is oral. So we do videos in that way to provide the descriptions and the results in a different way. And then we also do newsletters, and we help, like, for example, in this instance, many of the community members testified within their New Mexico legislature. So for that testimony, we helped with briefs that they could use for their testimony, based on the data that we collected. And yeah, so they were mostly short papers, not anything long, videos, and then radio forums. And so with any of the publications, we also have to go back and ensure that all the results are disseminated to the community prior to any kind of dissemination, including, conference presentations or manuscripts. And then it's so important to us that we have community co-authors, because they're involved in every step of the research process. They have intellectually contributed to that manuscript. So we ensure that our community partners and community members are either acknowledged or, and there's always community authors, co-authors on our manuscript. Thank you.
Yeah, I guess just to add to that too, that point of co-authorship, I think is really important. So yeah, I would definitely agree with that. And I like the give before you get as well. So a lot of the work that I've been doing, it starts off, especially with doing presentations or workshops with the school. Almost every year we kind of start off the year by doing that, and often I'll involve my undergrad students, and they could be a mix of Indigenous and non-Indigenous students, but pretty much every year, even if we're just continuing the same project, we visit with the school, and that's something that anytime I've met with either chief and council or with the lands departments that I work with, that's like front and center. So that we always do. And then where it's possible, just write directly into the grant salary money to hire students, summer students oftentimes, or even to second employee for a day, for an X number of days, so that money is going to the community, either through the individual. And then the other thing that's more recent, and at least within my own work, is where the community themselves, or whether it's we have tribal councils here, whether it's at the tribal council level or organizational level, if they lead the grant, I'm more than happy to basically be a collaborator on that grant as well. So I think in terms of trust building, the university doesn't have to take a 25% cut of overhead either. So if the organization or the community is able to lead the grant and I'm a collaborator, I'm happy to do that as well, because we can still do the work, but they're cash managing everything. So in terms of building trust, that's something that I've been willing to do. It doesn't look as good on the CV when it comes to my peers evaluating me, but it's what enables the work in terms of the long game, I think, to be better enabled. So I guess those are just a couple things that I wanted to add to what the two others have said, which I totally agree with.
Awesome. So we have 2 audience questions. So Star, did you want to read yours aloud?
Sure, I can do that. Give me one sec. Yeah, I think a lot of it was answered in what was said, but I was just curious about like how more ways to involve communities in the interpretation of data, especially if you are in a role that does not allow much contact with the population. So yeah, being in a more like disconnected state, but still wanting to involve communities like in the interpretation. I think I would be curious if anyone has points on that.
I guess I just have a really specific example that came out of our current situation with the pandemic. And that is with one of the communities that I've been working with for the last 5 years or so. We've had sort of desktop projects that undergrad students will do, and it's often based on GIS sort of type of projects. And typically we would visit the community, but with COVID, we weren't able to do that. And so actually what ended up being way more impactful and successful than we ever thought was that the students actually, they created a video. And because a lot of our work is visual in representation, so we're working with maps, a lot of our data can be presented using those maps and other it's all geospatial. And we had drone footage that I was able to collect in the summer, but the students were able to take what I couldn't have taken and take the time that I didn't have and actually produce something that I then was able to show to the community via Zoom call that had way more impact than a lot of the other presentations that we had done in the past that were in person. And it just sort of came out of adapting to the situation of COVID, but I think it's something that will incorporate better as we go forward and as we're able to revisit in person. So, that was one way. And I say that because my undergraduate students would be in that position of not having much contact with the population. Otherwise, they weren't doing on the ground research. The project was always meant to be a desktop project, which the community was entirely supportive of. It was fine, but by using this technology, it kind of elevated that interaction. So that was just a really simple example of how weird things kind of come out of whatever kind of desperate times, I suppose. But just a simple example.
Thank you.
Great. And we just have one more question. Cecilia, would you like to ask your question?
Sure. So I'm really grateful that the panelists have spoken to the tension between wanting to do this community-based research, and it not necessarily being valued in the same way by the academy, and how they've kind of navigated, chasing tenure and those other things, right, that you have to. And I'm just curious if you guys have any thoughts about how we kind of can navigate those tensions as graduate students when we don't necessarily have, there's a different power differential, right, that we're having to address as we're trying to do that.
I can say something. I was like, hey, I can talk. I think one thing that's popping up into my head that we kind of talked about, I think Melissa was talking about it, is to or Carlette, I think you also, try to find that faculty ally or faculty mentor, and it doesn't have to be at your institution either. It can be at another institution, someone that you reach out to, and at minimum can just be like, hey, how are you doing what you're doing? And you can learn from that person, but at max that person can be a supportive person, maybe it can be on your committee. So I think trying to find those people is helpful, because then at minimum they're understanding where you're coming from. They're doing that if they're doing that kind of work. So that's one thing I would say. Do y'all have anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. Mentorship is key. I think for me, myself, I mean, how do I get to where I am is because of everyone who supported me throughout the way. And I just am so lucky, right? Like so lucky. And so, and that's where I see my role is like where I can be a mentor in any way, in the best way that I can. That's what I try to do. But yeah, I think finding those people that align with your, you know, with your worldview and what you want to do and where you see yourself going. I often feel like most of my grad students, my undergrad students, are smarter than me. So let me use my position to like let them do more awesome work. But yeah, I think mentorship is a really key thing, and it's hard to know necessarily when you're able to like completely actualize that relationship. But I think where you see it, like latch on as best as you can. Yeah, I don't know. I guess that's all I had to say, is just supporting that comment. I think where you can find your mentors, and those mentors don't necessarily have to be academics per se, right? They could be community members who are experts within whatever that field is that they're working in. Because if you can take what you learn from them and bring it to the academy, you're also positioning your own self as somebody who's relatively privileged as being a graduate student at a pretty prestigious institution, right? So I think there's ways that we can like navigate our positions. Anyways, thank you.
Dr. Chief, did you have any other last ideas or thoughts you want to share with us?
Yes, I think I agree about the mentorship, mainly because it for Dr. Arcand and I, we haven't been trained in community-based work, so having a mentor is critical for me as well in ensuring that I'm doing it correctly. And through all my science and engineering education, I unfortunately didn't have very much interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary training. And so as a faculty, I was able to do that, but yet I didn't have the training to do so. So I really relied on mentors to help me through that process. And then also being able to take some courses. I was able to take some online courses from other universities, like on health disparities, community-based research, and then just reading the articles. And so you're never, expected to know everything. So being in the community as well, even though I'm from the Navajo Nation and I speak Dene, I still do need that mentorship too, to ensure that I'm also being respectful and considerate in every way that I should be. So, I think having mentorship in your work is really important at any stage of your career, even as being a faculty member. Thank you.
Well, as we end our time here today, I just want to give snaps to all of our panelists. It was really a privilege and a pleasure to be able to share this space with three women who I definitely admire and look up to as we move through our academic journeys. I think it's really important to be able to see ourselves reflected in really good work that's happening. So thank you so much for everyone for coming. Again, if you could fill out the chat, the survey in the chat. And our next panel will be on Thursday, April 8th, and it will feature Dr. Ren Yo Wang, who is an assistant professor of gender studies. So we look forward to seeing you again soon. So thank you so much and have a wonderful week, and really enjoyed our time here together. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Jarita, and thank you everyone else. Really privilege and pleasure to meet you all.
Yes, thank you, Jarita, and great to meet you. Melissa and Lydia, hope to meet you one day.
Yes, it was great.
Great work you're doing.
Yeah, I learned so much. I was taking notes.
I learned a lot too. I'm so glad I accepted this panel because I don't know how I would have ever come across you two. So
Exactly. No, it's really great.